Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. To better promote poverty alleviation efforts in the country, China set October the 17th as the annual day for the eradication of poverty in 2014. 2 years have passed. What challenges are still lying ahead? What should be done to promote China's poverty alleviation work? What lessons can we draw before we move forward? And what about problems in other parts of the world? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Li Mankui from Southwest University of Political Science and Law, and Rick Dunham, visiting scholar from Tsinghua University. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
China's fight against poverty is at a crucial stage. Since 1978, when the Reform and Opening Up drive was launched, China has lifted more than 700 million of its citizens out of poverty. The number of people China has taken out of poverty accounts for 70% of the world's total. The proportion of people living in extreme poverty fell from 61% in 1990 to 4.2% in 2014. To fight poverty, China assigned special poverty relief funds amounting to 189.84 billion yuan from 2011 to 2015. But China still faces a lot of pressure because of its huge population. By the end of 2015, there were 14 contiguous poor areas with special difficulties, 832 impoverished counties, 128,000 registered poor villages, and 55.75 million people living in poverty, which is the equivalent of the entire population of a medium-sized country. To eradicate poverty by 2020, China pledged to lift 10 million people out of poverty every year from 2016. While combating poverty at home, China has also supported other developing countries in the cause. For the past 6 decades, China has provided 400 billion yuan to 166 countries and international organizations. It sent more than 600,000 aid workers overseas, given medical assistance to 69 countries, and aided more than 120 developing countries in realizing the Millennium Goals.
Mankui, problem is how many more impoverished people do we still have today in China?
Well, as mentioned by the white paper on China's progress in poverty reduction and human rights, as of 2016, there are now currently 55 million people still living under today's poverty line.
What is the concept of poverty line?
Well, in 20, China has kept account, make adjustment to the poverty line. If I recall correctly, last year China raised the poverty line to 2,855 RMB per person per year. If your annual income is less than 2,855, then you are live under poverty line, will be classified as low-income family here in Chinese system.
Or $2 worth of purchasing power on average for the individuals in China. Is that true?
Yes, based on the estimation that our current standards roughly is equals to $2, the per person per day standard, or is based on the purchasing power parity in 2011. It's slightly higher, even higher than that one.
Rick, you've been doing business reporting for years. How much do you know about our Alleviation campaign here in China?
Well, it's pretty well known. Number one, the number of people who have been lifted out of poverty in the past 30 years is the largest number in the history of humanity. But there also are some persistent problems in China, in remote rural areas in particular, getting programs to the people, and in terms of inequality in income, inequality in education in rural and remote areas, and also economic opportunities in bringing business to those areas. So China has come a long way, but it has some very difficult problems to try to solve.
We are not expected to just praise what the government has done in alleviating how many people are out of poverty. We are addressing real issues. Now, let me know, Mankui, the enduring adversity of challenges is still lying ahead.
Well, there are many challenges. The white paper already mentioned some problems, the challenges lying ahead for the poverty alleviation in the next 5 years by 2020. So I would like to mention two of them, which I think is the biggest challenge for the poverty reduction efforts in China. The first one is that, though this year we will have 55 million people living under poverty line, waiting to be lifted out of poverty by 2020. This number compared with 700 million, that's a small one. But we have to put this in context. After 30 years, poverty reduction efforts, this group of people hasn't been touched. So that means that, this group of people may be the most vulnerable, the most marginalized group. So,
is that why the Chinese authorities said recently that we should undertake the precise poverty relief campaign in Chinese 精准扶贫? What does that actually mean?
Yes, indeed. So, as I mentioned, this group of people are the most vulnerable and marginalized group. So we need to mapping out the causes underlying their poverty. Some of them may have difficulty in finding decent employment opportunities. Some of them may living in really remote area, which cannot be touched by any like transportation vehicles. Some of them may lose their capacity. So we need...
But this number, I'm afraid, is very large. Most of them are the ethnic minority groups living in mountainous areas that can hardly be accessed by the relief efforts. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the reason why, in the white paper, we also have some targeted measures, for those ethnic minority groups to help them relocate, so that they can relocate to some economically productive area, so that they can benefit from the infrastructure building, the creation of employment opportunities, etc.
Up to 85% of the impoverished population live in rural and mountainous areas. Is that one of the major problems?
Yes, I think so. That's one of the major problems about inequality. You mentioned that 85% of them living in rural areas. So there is kind of inequality between urban and rural areas. So current poverty reduction efforts is mainly focused in rural areas in order to tackle this inequality problem. So that is also part of the challenge.
I won't make any comparison in parallel with the United States, which is a sole superpower with the end of the Cold War, the richest country in the world in many, many ways and according to many standards. But Rick, you still have some minority groups that need to be alleviated out of poverty. For example, ethnic groups like Eskimos in Alaska. And in the case of Australia, back in the year 2000, when I was covering the Olympic Games in Sydney, I was briefed about how difficult it was for the local authorities in Australia to relocate Aboriginal people from their tribal areas to the more prosperous urban areas. They refused to be relocated. Yes. Do you think this also applies to some of the dilemmas you have in the United States?
I think it's very similar. I think what you say about Australia is similar to the United States with Native Americans, whether in Alaska, what would sometimes be called Eskimo or American Indian in the continental United States, because people are living in, it's not remote areas, but they're called reservations, where it is just open to the tribes. And in those areas, there are problems with education, problems with finding jobs, problems with drugs and alcohol, and the government cannot force people to move. And so one of the great challenges is how to improve the living standards for people who are, you could say, remote, but it's within the United States. China has similar problems with some ethnic minorities, but it's compounded by the terrain, by people who are in remote mountainous areas.
Let me go back to the question up to 85% of those in rural areas. With the current slowdown in our economic growth, will that impact negatively the speed of our poverty relief?
Well, to some extent, the answer is yes. I mean, the current poverty reduction efforts will depend on, a massive amount of investment, right? With the current, slowdown or downward pressure of the economy. So there will be, the central government and different levels of government, they will face pressures in how to fund the money in the context of downward economy. But I think the targets of poverty reduction, even in the context of downward economy, is still achievable because China had already built a nascent social protection floor. We have put in place basic medical insurance system, which covers over 97% of the population. And we have put in place old age pension system, which also covers over like 95% of the population. We have put in place a minimum living guarantee system, both in urban area and rural areas. So these provide kind of like a social protection floor, even in case of like contingencies like unemployment, or in the contingencies of like illnesses, disability. They still have something to count on.
But I'm afraid the role of the media is somehow to question the accuracy of official statistics. Well, there's still a long learning curve for the Chinese media to follow this path of investigating into the official statistics. For example, I raised this question in the context of an audit report that was released this June. Back in 2015, up to 151 million poverty alleviation fund worth of RMB was fraudulently claimed or misused. And this report is just based on a random inspection of 40 counties in 17 provinces. What should be done to improve effective supervision in a country where, freedom of the media could not be compared to that in developed nations?
Well, let's start with historical comparison. When I read that, there is a similarity to the Great Society period, the war on poverty in the United States in the 1960s. The government threw a lot of money at poverty, trying to reduce the number of people in poverty, and there was a lot of corruption. The difference that you cited is that it's easier to have media oversight in the United States, to do anecdotal evidence, to go out and investigate. But there are these reports now. I mean, there are government reports that reporters could follow in China. I would take the leads. I always say to my journalism students, follow the money. So you would look, where is the money going? Where are the programs? What has the government identified as a problem? And then go there and see how far you can go to try to look into the issues.
Some of the counties, maybe the number is put at over 200 in China, refuse to remove the label of impoverished county from their hands. Why? Because they still expect to enjoy the relief funds, and the relief funds would end up being abused in many ways. Is that the case? From your perspective, do you think this is a common practice, a common malpractice?
Well, this is a very interesting question. For these poverty-stricken counties, they refuse to be removed from that list. You rightly mentioned that. The reason why they are reluctant to be removed because that status on that list will have special preferential policies and also have like a poverty relief fund. But now the situation has changed. We have declared war on poverty, and the poverty will be reduced or eliminated by 2020. So I think now we should switch gear and to provide some kind of like disincentive for these counties to be on that list. Or in other words, we can provide financial incentives for these counties, if they are successfully to be removed from that list. And I would also like to add that we should also put in place an effective monitoring mechanism to monitor the incidence of poverty. The State Council established a kind of like a exit mechanism for these counties. If the incidence of poverty reduced to reduced to 2% in the central China or reduced to below 3% in western China, then these counties will be removed from that list. I think if we put in place an effective monitoring mechanism there, and monitor their incidence of poverty, and once they have reached that threshold, they will be removed. Period.
Your positive comments are based on the official estimation, or is that your personal observation?
Well, that's mainly my personal one.
your
personal one, yeah.
the outcome of your personal academic study.
Yes.
Rick, do you believe what he says?
It sounds right to me, both as an academic and as a longtime reporter. I mean, when I see the issues of the counties not wanting to be get off a list, it reminds me of the failing school districts in the United States. And at some point in the last 15 years, the government has gone in and said, if you continue to be a failing school district, the government can take over your school district, the state government. This may be a similar situation where you want to have a disincentive for the counties and say, if you continue to be a failing county, if you don't improve, then someone else will come in and run the programs for you.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Rick Dunham and Professor Li Mankui. We're discussing what the challenges will be ahead for our poverty reduction campaign. China is held as a very good example in reducing the impoverished population by millions over the past 3 decades. We'll be back to address these and other issues. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Mankui, obviously, China boasts of a huge floating population, meaning migrant workers in their millions crisscrossing this country, finding jobs, settling in the more prosperous urban areas. What about the left behind the children, the elderly, the pensioners, the retirees in rural areas in the first place, and of course the unemployed in urban areas? I mean, what about eventually the challenges for the social security program?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you are right. Mentions that this labor mobility issue or the migrant workers issue has been very, instrumental in solving China's poverty issue.
The essence of this problem, I'm afraid, is the hukou system.
Yes, and hukou system is still some kind of like a hindrance to the free flow of the population. And you also mentioned that there are a lot of like social problems caused by this the flow of migrant workers, like left behind children, the unsupported seniors back in the rural area. So for these issues, that's what we should count on the social protection system. As I mentioned that nowadays, China, we put in place a nascent social protection floor, so everyone will have something to count on. In terms of, we have a basic social health floor. Almost everyone is covered under this basic Medicare system and the social pension floor. So we also, almost 90% of the population covered by that. And also, for these left behind children, in our white paper, we also have some kind of like a targeted measures for these left behind children in terms of, their access to education. But there are still big challenges, especially think about the unequal access to the education compared with their counterparts in the urban areas.
I wonder, both of you noticed a front page sensational story that took place in a remote province, a remote county in a remote province. It's an expanded family. The mother killed all of her children because partly and allegedly that she could not live up to the standards of a poverty relief fund because of violation of the family planning policy. How serious and how brutal could the consequences of such problems be for you?
Well, I see that as an individual tragedy. I don't know how widespread the issue is. I think, the biggest problems for parents in these poor rural areas is the opportunity. And until there are economic opportunities closer to home, they are going to go like magnets to the big cities. And as long as their children are not permitted to move with them and to go to public schools in the big cities, you're going to have this social dislocation. So I think the first challenge for the government is these very remote areas that are hard to get to. The wider challenge is this challenge of the migrant population, and it all ties into income inequality and economic inequality, with booming areas in China and areas that are left behind. And I think that's something that's hard to wrestle with, but you have to do it step by step by step.
Internal immigration always comes across as a challenge for politicians, either in China or in regional blocs such as the European Union. given the demands of the Schengen Agreement. Are you suggesting that free movement of human resources could help somehow alleviate poverty?
It would help, but it also could cause dislocation if, like in the United States at the end of the 19th century, people just abandoned the farms and you had a massive relocation because there was no limit on it. That's the potential risk in China is that you take so many people out of the rural areas that you can't handle all of the agricultural needs of the country, and the cities would have too many people for the services they could provide. There has to be something in between where you can have freer movement without allowing everyone to go at any time, because a complete free market system in humans, if it were implemented immediately, would probably be chaotic.
2 decades ago, I was covering many problems in remote areas, such as Tibet, where birth control policy turned out to be pretty loose. It's not as draconian as in the hinterland. I mean, it's pretty common for a family to have at least 5 children under the same roof. Now, given the serious violation of birth control policy, Manhui, as well as the tragedy that I spoke of a few minutes ago that could have happened in Gansu, if my memory is reliable.
Yes.
Now, how serious are such consequences arising from a violation of a family planning policy? The local government refused to compensate for the extra birth.
Mm-hmm. Well, go back to your question about the tragic story. I was really saddened by that tragic story, and that reveals some kind of defects in our poverty standards recognition mechanism. Because it will be in the hands of the village heads, right? So I mean, to me, we need to put in place some kind of supervision, really effective supervision mechanism, and encourage participation from the low-income families, so that we can prevent those kind of families who are indeed living under poverty line, but they cannot get that benefits. And back to your second question regarding the problems caused by the violation of the birth control or the family planning. Yes, I mean, especially in some of the ethnic minority areas, it can be widespread. It can be widespread, and usually speaking, if you have many children, and there will be kind of very limited resources to afford them to go to school. So that means some of the children will have very little access to education. So I mean, this will go down past the generational line, or we could intergenerational passage of poverty. So this will pose challenge, I mean, for our poverty reduction efforts.
We've discussed the issue of social security program that's meant to cover 95 or 99% of the Chinese territory. But what about education and equal access to education in those difficult areas?
Well,
and as well as education for children of migrant workers in the prosperous urban areas, can they benefit equally from the social entitlements?
This is a very good question. Yes, I mean, equality and non-discrimination is part of the principle of the social security, and also from the human rights approach to poverty alleviation strategies. China's government has done a lot in terms of increase or improve access to education in the rural area, but nowadays there is still a very significant problem in terms of equality of education. We can see clearly there is a gap or discrepancy in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the qualification of the teachers. So nowadays, for the rural students, and especially for those left behind children who sometimes cannot participate in schools in the places where their parents work, they will have sometimes have difficult time in access to quality education. So this will be a hindrance for an effective poverty reduction strategy.
When we look at the accuracy and precision of our poverty relief campaign, let's look at perhaps the worsening situation in northeastern China, where most of the SOE are located, with the current official policies to dissuade state-owned enterprises which contributed to the labor-intensive manufacturing and are not very environmentally friendly. More people would be made redundant and become unemployed overnight. Do both of you believe that poverty reduction will be an imminent issue for those who have been made redundant?
I think definitely, because in the same way that in the industrial heartland of America, you had a generation of workers losing their jobs because of globalization and factories closing, you're going to have a large number of workers in Dongbei who are made redundant, who lose their jobs as a result of the changes in the Chinese economy, the shifting in the new normal economy of China.
It's not those who have lost their jobs, but people are getting old in these three provinces, Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning. Most of the young labor force have moved down to the southern parts of this country. Therefore, pensioners and retirees could become a problem for the local governments who face a rapid decline in their economic growth.
Yes, first back to your first question regarding the industrial or the restructuring of the industry. Yes, it happens always in the era of globalization, right? So many workers can be can be redundant or laid off by the SOEs. But we need to develop like e-commerce and other labor-intensive industries to host this economically active population. So this is the answer to your first question. To the second one, yes, this is the very realistic problem for the pension, old age pension system. So the China's government need to fund different source of funding for this pension, and also the government is now think about or reform this retirement age to postpone it from 60 to 65, so that this can save more money for the old age pension.
Very quickly, Rick, after years of trials and experiments, China established a model of party leadership, government guidance, and social participation. What can the social organizations such as NPO and NGO do to assist the authorities, the officials, in the poverty relief campaign?
Well, they need to figure out a way to have a cooperative relationship. I mean, right now, NGOs are in a tense situation often with the Chinese government, and so they have to figure out a way to allow, the government has to figure out a way to allow NGOs in to do their own work with some level of autonomy, and the NGOs need to be willing to go the places where the government needs the help the most.
As most of the companies are getting rich, they should have more social responsibilities in helping government. With that, we'll come to the end of this discussion and brainstorming about how to further reduce poverty in China. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.